Hi, and welcome to my third video on painting and weathering the AFV Club Avery. First thing I'm going to do is paint the tools. The paints I use here are both Vallejo, German Grey and Pale Sand. First of all, I paint all the metal areas of the tools in the German Grey, then mix a little of the Pale Sand and then apply this in like a wash, getting lighter as I paint over the metal. I keep the brush moving so as tide marks don't start to appear as I thin the paint with some water. Once happy with that effect, and as you can see I've painted the pickaxe head which is under the blade of the shovels or spades. You can see here that I lighten the paint quite a lot and put it around the edges where the paint that's been applied to the metal, and then just blend it in with a little bit of water. But as I said, keep the brush moving so you don't get any tide marks. It's now on to paint the wood. For this I use Vallejo's Japanese highlights. Just painting along the wood. I might add a little bit of pale sand to the mixture into the centre of each of the shafts just to lighten it somewhat. Any overpaint that gets onto the vehicle I tend to remove with some Vallejo's airbrush cleaner. Now to paint the wood grain and the fake shadows. For this I use oil brusher, which is from MIG, dark brown. Paint this around the clasps, and around the metal heads on the spades where the metal meets the shaft. Once I've painted it in, I then get a softer brush and just feather it out. And as you can see, it's quite effective and gives the appearance of a worn look to the wooden handles. To give a rust tone to the metal parts of the tools, I use some burnt sienna oil paint, some enamel thinner, made a wash, and just applied this to the tools. And I also use this on the exhaust shroud just to add a bit more of a rust tone. To paint the periscope glass, I used Vallejo's London Grey, Off-White. Mixed these together, painted the glass, and then when dry use some Tamiya Clear Green. It will take a few coats of this before it becomes quite convincing. Here you can see the first coat applied and the glass looks lime green, but after a few more layers it is quite convincing. To paint the machine guns on the model, I first used Vallejo's London Grey and some buff oil paint. Painted the machine guns with the grey, made a wash with the oil paints and some enamel thinners, and just applied this wash over them to give a dusty look. Now to paint the jack block. For this I used Vallejo buff, painted both jack blocks, then applied a wash using some Van Dyke brown oil paint and some enamel thinners. Layered this on in several coats, let each coat dry for a couple of minutes before doing this, and then with a soft brush dragged it across to add some wood grain. Any overpaint on the model you can just remove with some clean thinners. I now use some Vallejo German Grey to paint the steel bands around the jack block. To pick out the detail on the cam nets, I first took some olive green oil paint and some buff, mixed this together, and then using a soft brush, dry brushed the cam net on the turret and on the hull, which picks out all the raised detail. To paint the tow cable along the side of the vehicle, I used some Vallejo German Grey. I just took my time with a finely pointed brush, picking the tow cable out. You can probably see to the left I've used some Vallejo mud with a little bit of static grass, just experimenting here, but I'll go on to explain how I did the mud and grass later on in the video. Once the paint on the tow cable was dry, I then used some MIG track wash and just layered this over the original paint that I'd applied. And now it's time to paint the stowage and the tarpaulins. I used several oil colours, put them on an old piece of paper which removes some of the linseed oil. And then I paint the stowage to match the painting I'd done earlier with acrylics. Painting the oils on quite thinly because I don't want to overdo the effect because they can get quite grainy. Once the base colour has been applied, I then use the other shades to add the creases and the highlights that you'll see in a second. As I said, here I am dabbing on a lighter colour, and then I'll just blend it out just to pick up the creases and areas that might catch the sunlight. The straps were painted using oils again, but after a good couple of hours letting the oils dry. First I applied the dark tones and then a few lighter ones, just running down the straps. Now it was time to apply some caked on mud. For this I used Vallejo mud light brown along with some static grass, which I then cut up into smaller pieces. I tried this out earlier on the front of the hull, and now it was time to put it all over the vehicle. Here I am dabbing it onto the rear, mixing some of the static grass into it, layering it on. Any unwanted mud can be removed with water, which acted like a wash, which was quite handy on the tracks. Applied it on all sides, in the mud chutes at the front and onto the lower hull, front and back. I now got some fine soil from my garden and applied this all around the top of the hull, moving it about to where I think it would gather. Then using some PVA glue mixed with water, applied this. And then moved it around with a soft brush until I was happy. This needed 24 hours to dry. Now it's time to add a dusty look to the model. For this I took my airbrush, some Tamiya Buff, heavily thinned this with their own thinner, and then sprayed on this mixture around the front of the hull, the tracks, the lower hull side and the rear, along with the fine soil that I'd applied to the top of the hull earlier. I also sprayed it around the lower part of the turret. And into any recesses where you may think dust will accumulate. Now to paint the leather pads on the cruise hatch, I took some Vallejo flat brown. Once this had dried, I then painted it with some burnt sienna, yellow ochre and white. Using these last two colours just to highlight the wear. And then with a little bit of darker oil paint, just dabbed in the middle and blended in, just to make it look where it had been worn. To add even more dust effects to the vehicle, I now use some Wilder's light dust oil paint, thinned this with some enamel thinners, applied it all over the top of the hull, down the sides and into recesses, and then blended it out. This gives a variation in tone to the buff colour that I'd sprayed on earlier. To vary the tone of the earth on top of the hull, I took some MIG Earth Effects and just painted this and dabbed this under the turret race and into more recesses, blending the edges out with some enamel thinner. Then adding some Van Dyke Brown to the Earth Effects, added some darker tones and again blended the edges out with some thinner. I also applied this to the mud, blending it out and dragging it down. Here I am adding it to the tracks. And flicking it on to the sides and front of the hull to give the effect of splashes of the tracks are going through wet ground or puddles, etc. Now it's time to add some wet mud. For this I used MIG wet mud and stippled it onto the lower hull in a random pattern and over where some of the dry and damp mud had been applied earlier. How I add metal effects to the vehicle is to take a graphite pencil, run it along a file, and then using the graphite dust, take a silicone tipped brush, and here I am using the graphite along the tow cable, which gives it a nice sheen. Then using a makeup applicator dipped into the graphite powder, I now applied it to the track treads, the towing eye, around the sides of the track. You can also polish this with your finger. I also used the pencil on its own to add a bit more wear onto certain areas of the model where I wanted the paint to have worn away and the metal to show through. To give a highly polished steel look to the treads, I used a Tamiya chrome pen, dipped a makeup applicator into the paint, and then again ran this over the treads. Then using my finger, dipped in the graphite powder, applied this on top of the paint, which dulls the sheen down a little bit, but just gives a variation in tone. Now using 502 Absolum engine grease oil paint, I now added marks and spills and spillages around the vehicle, some heavy, some thinned out with a little bit of enamel thinners. Here I am painting on the rear deck and on the rear of the hull, running down from where the grease may have run out of the bearings on the wheel and around the hatches, anywhere you think where stains might appear. Here you can see the effect of all the staining along the rear of the hull, around the turret race and around the hatches, and it does look quite effective. Now it's time to paint the padlock on the turret's rear stowage block. I used some Vallejo oily steel. Then to paint the scratches either side of the padlock, I used some Vallejo Russian green. When this had all dried, I then applied a dark wash with some dark oil paint thinned with enamels. Now it was time to apply the spotlight to the commander station. I got a sheet of these lenses from a local hobby store. Now although they are too big for headlights, they are good for spotlights on vehicles. I first painted the spotlight silver, then applied a dab of gloss varnish, then taking the lens from the paper, applied it with some tweezers. Now it's time to fix the crew. I test fitted these throughout the painting and weathering process, but now it's time to fix them in place permanently. And now it's time to add some detail painting. I'd used the oils that previously had been used on the vehicle, and now just picked out a few areas, such as around the hatches, some of the bolts, and the clasps that held the tools on. And now it's time to finish off the petard mortar. I painted this in some Vallejo German grey, and now dry brushed in some Vallejo London grey. There's no need for a lot of detail painting on the mortar, as it will be going in the barrel, as you'll see shortly. To apply soot to the exhausts, I first put in some paper underneath them. I just dabbed on some black pigment. Then removed the paper so as not to affect any of the tools underneath. I'd previously painted an empty wooden box along with some tins such as rations or food that they'd managed to get hold of, and now applied these to the rear hull and added a little dust wash to the top of the tins. And here she is finished. You can see how one effect on top of the other adds more life to the model. I hope you've enjoyed the video and picked up a few hints and tips, or maybe refreshed your memory over some of them. Please like and subscribe, it's free. Please leave a comment and I'll get back to you. I think next I might do a Tiger. Cheerio.